The average person in Europe has a carbon footprint of 6 tonnes of CO2 a year. In the United States, it's around 16 tonnes. But for the people who are in the top 0.1% of all the wealthiest in the world, they tend to have a carbon footprint of around 217 tonnes of CO2 a year. It's absolutely enormous. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is 10:30 on Thursday, the 11th of November. We're at Farnborough Airport, which describes itself as Europe's #1 private jet airport. But when it comes to the damage they're doing to this world, their high carbon lifestyles are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, I think I can show they are the #1 cause for not only climate change, but for our lack of action in tackling them. So in this video, I'm going to look at 5 different ways the wealthiest people in the world are doing the most damage to the climate and to our attempts to try and reduce their emissions. But first of all, we need to understand what the wealthiest people in the world are like. The super rich are so rich now, there's a problem, and it's got nothing to do with climate change. The average person, we need friends and family to help us live our lives. If you fall off your bicycle or your car breaks down, you need the help of passers-by. We learn from quite an early age that even if you don't agree with someone, cooperation is a really important part of being human and an important part of being part of society. There's a protest about the private jets at the airport. Yeah. They're only at this one gate. It's more of a symbolic shutting down the airport. All the other gates will be open. I've just seen there's 2 security guards there. They could help you if I could go and get them. Or otherwise, depending on how well you know the airport, you could find the gates.
I need to go to my office, so...
Okay. Well, then,
having sat through 2 hours of 16:45 versus
the protest isn't against you. You know that,
I know that,
yeah.
But as someone who works for this, I think we're missing that.
Well, if you'd like to come back and have a chat on the live stream, give you a point of view, we're non-violent, we're tediously dull.
I know that.
You're welcome to come back. Okay, well, thank you for being nice to us.
That's all right, no worries. Thank you.
Living in a society, it helps keep us on the straight and narrow. The super rich are so wealthy now, they don't need any of that. They can have whatever they want, whenever they want. They don't need other people. They socialise less often than the average person, and when they do, they're less engaged. This is all academic research by psychologists, by the way, not my opinion. Because they don't socialise so much, they sort of lose their moral compass. They become more insular. They buy solitude by buying bigger houses, travelling in private jets. They're less compassionate. According to psychologists, they're more likely to lie when filling out their tax returns, more likely to cheat when playing games. They're more selfish, much less considerate to other road users when driving. They prioritise themselves before other people. The richer someone is, the more likely they are to shoplift. It seems that the more wealthy you are, the more leniently you are treated when you break the law. But it's not just the academics who believe this. Here are some examples of people who have direct experience of their very wealthiest. According to one Kmart loss prevention manager, he said, millionaires think they are above the law and get away with anything. Someone who had worked as a hotel operations manager for 10 years said, the hotel industry shows how disconnected the wealthy are from the world. The higher the price of the room, the more common it is to be treated as less than human. The more money you have, the more dehumanized you become. The problem is, nowadays, the wealthy are so wealthy, you know, the top 0.1% or the top 1% are so much richer than everyone else, and they're becoming richer. But it turns out somebody who has a very comfortable, high carbon lifestyle doesn't want to change. They don't want environmental protection, and by the way, they don't want you to have healthcare or social security. In a previous video, we looked at what happens when people are running out of water in North Mexico, 23 million people relying on reservoirs that are dangerously low. We saw there's no more running water in the houses. If you can't afford bottled water, you have to drink dirty water from the water tankers. Well, here's another example of people running out of water, and this time it's from the point of view of the wealthy and it's some wealthy people in California. In California, they had a drought for quite a long time. They're running out of water. The authorities are imposing water restrictions. So this is how the wealthy people respond to being told they need to reduce the amount of water they're using. People should not be forced to live on property with brown lawns or apologise for wanting their gardens to be beautiful. We pay significant property taxes based on where we live, and no, we're not all equal when it comes to water. That's a really important thing. The water, which is a public resource, the wealthy people think they're entitled to have more of it because they pay more tax. And they go on to say, California used to be the land of opportunity and freedom. It's slowly becoming the land of one group telling everybody else how they think everybody should live their lives, i.e. the public authorities telling the very wealthy to stop wasting a public resource. But this is another thing psychologists have noticed. The wealthy people, they feel they're living their lives properly. They don't really understand why people don't like selfish, greedy people. So they feel a bit like they're being punished, they're being put upon. They think if someone tells them to stop wasting water, it's outrageous tyranny. I realise I am generalising a bit. There are good wealthy people. For example, the man who gave away the Patagonia clothing company, which is worth about $1 billion. And Bill Gates says he's going to give away his fortune, although I think Bill Gates has a surprisingly high carbon footprint. And in the United States, it's got to be such a problem now. There are millionaires demanding to pay more tax. So there are some good wealthy people, but I think I ought to warn you, 1 in 5 business leaders have psychopathic tendencies. Now you're experts in understanding wealthy people. We'll just do one test and then we'll be on to the 5 different ways the wealthy are destroying the world. So it looks as though the chief executives of Britain's top 100 companies are going to have an average pay rise this year of 23%. Now, do you think they're having such a good pay rise because their businesses are 23% more successful, or they've been working 23% harder? Or do you think they're selfish, self-centered people who prioritise their own needs above those of everybody else? Over there in the distance somewhere, I don't know if you can make it out, there's a big white area. That is Farnborough Airport, and it describes itself as Europe's #1 business jet airport. If you were to take the train between London and Paris on a return journey on Eurostar, so go on the train, then your carbon footprint for that journey would be around 8 kilograms of CO2. If you were to do the same journey in an aircraft, an ordinary commercial airliner, your carbon footprint would be around 200 kilograms if you calculate it following the British government's guidance to multiply the actual emissions by 1.9, because if you emit the carbon high up in the atmosphere, it's much more damaging. So around about effectively is 200 kilograms of CO2. If you fly from Farnborough Airport in a private jet to Paris and back again, so it's 1 hour 20 minutes each way. Maybe you're having a long weekend, because you're very wealthy. Where else would you spend the weekend other than Paris? Then your carbon footprint for that return journey would be 4,000 kilograms. To put that in some sort of perspective, that's probably the average carbon footprint for the average person living in Britain, for a whole year. So all their heating, all their transport, all the electricity they use, all the manufactured goods, all the food they eat, would have the same damage to the environment as a single return trip to Paris from Farnborough Airport in a private jet. And it's because if you're flying in a commercial airliner, it works out the airliner is burning 5 gallons of aviation fuel per passenger per hour. In a private jet, they only carry on average 2 or 3 passengers, so it works out as per passenger they're burning 100 gallons of aviation fuel an hour. It's absolutely astonishing. This is why the wealthy people have such large carbon footprints. If you think of all the causes of carbon dioxide that humans are responsible for, food, electricity, heating, there's a limit to how much food even the fattest millionaire can eat. They have more houses and they're bigger, so they take more heating. But even the most drafty, enormous house isn't going to take 100 gallons of fuel an hour to keep it warm. And it's not just private jets, it's private super yachts as well. So for example, Roman Abramovich, it's thought that 70% of his carbon footprint is just down to his private yachts. And even a small super yacht will burn probably 100 gallons of marine diesel an hour when it's being used. So it is very polluting. And although I'm talking about the very wealthiest people, it's true for everyone. So for example, in the European Union, the wealthiest 1% of people, 41% of their carbon footprint is made up by flying. And for the poorest 50% of people in Europe, flying only accounts for 1% of their carbon footprint. So sometimes people say, well, we should have a carbon tax or increase the cost of flying. That's not a very effective way of doing it, because the wealthy people would just pay more money, they've got lots of money, whereas it would really affect the poor people who fly very little and probably only fly when they need to. So this is an important thing we can reduce a lot of our carbon emissions by changing the way we live. And as we'll see later on in the video, that's becoming more important. And the people who need to change their lives the most are the very wealthiest. And if you remember from a previous video, we saw as climate change continues, as it becomes more difficult to live our lives, societies will become under stress, and it will be more important to have high levels of social cohesion, that we're all equal and we're all in it together. The second way I think the wealthiest people are destroying our world is by the political influence that they have. 30 years ago, there was no climate denialism. There was none of this party political divide on how to tackle climate change. Joseph Stiglitz, who's quite a well-known economist, was serving on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 30 years ago. And he said there was none of this debate at all. The only thing people discussed was how quickly we needed to act to tackle climate change. So it seems to me there's nothing about human nature that makes it difficult for us to change our lives or to tackle climate change. There's nothing intrinsic in our global economy that means it's just too difficult to change. A lot of people have paid a lot of money to stop us transitioning and to slow down our efforts to tackle climate change. The motivations of the various cogs of the denial machine vary considerably, but the glue that holds most of them together is shared opposition to governmental regulatory efforts to ameliorate climate change. While the claims of these actors sometimes differ, the theme of no need for regulations remains constant. And who are the people who don't like regulations or the government telling them how to act? For example, when they're running out of water? The super rich. And it's a problem because they're quite good at influencing government policy. Economic elites and organised groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. We'll see later on what that means in practice. But it's a real David and Goliath struggle. If you're a wealthy person, according to the academic research, it's much easier for them to influence government policies. If you're a business, if you're a local employer, you have a lot of influence over the government. The ordinary people have to work quite hard to get their voices heard. And governments all around the world are changing the law to make it more difficult for ordinary people to stand up and protest about something which they're very concerned about. Sometimes you hear people say the big oil companies, who are very rich, have bought MPs or bought politicians, and they've given them so much money, the politicians do whatever they want. I don't think that's true for two reasons. First of all, the amount of money that politicians seem to receive from the big oil companies is quite small. In the United States, maybe it's about $3,000 or $4,000 for each politician. In Britain, maybe £2,000 or £3,000. Here's something I think that explains what's going on. Oil companies, petrostates, airports and businesses linked with Russian energy tycoons in the past 2 years combined, they have given about £812,000 to the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party in Britain is the party of the rich. It's a bit different since Brexit. It's changed a little bit, but really the Conservative Party is still the party of the rich. Okay, so, and compare that to £18,400, which was given to the Labour Party. So 2% of the money from the oil interests go to the Labour Party, which is sort of the party of the working people, although that's changed a bit since Brexit. And 98% of the money from the big oil interests goes to the party of the rich, the Conservative Party. And Conservative MPs also received about 99% of the £479,000 that these donors gave to individual politicians. Whereas most politicians get a small amount of money, the new British Prime Minister received £141,000 from energy interests this year alone, while he was campaigning to become the next Prime Minister. So, and he's the leader of the Conservative Party, okay? So, and he himself, I think he's a millionaire in his own right anyway. He's probably one of the richest Prime Ministers Britain's ever had. The rich people don't want to change. They want to carry on having their high carbon lifestyles, and they resent people telling them what to do, even if there's good scientific reason for them to change. And so when the oil companies are giving money, they're not buying the politicians, but they're just keeping on good terms. And as we'll see in a minute, the oil companies are only happy to sort of give the politicians leadership and guidance to help them maintain their lifestyle and maintain the current system. And here I've got a video. It's where a senior British politician is speaking. She's a member of the Conservative Party, the rich party, and she's warning, if I can find it here, she's warning her fellow members of Parliament
who do believe that they who don't like Brexit, who are Remainers, who have been able to whip up a number of MPs in the party, and I'm afraid that's just not acceptable. The donors have spoken today, some key people in the Conservative Party that you will hear about and see over the next hours.
The key part that lady was saying was the donors have spoken, and the members of Parliament need to take account of what the donors think, okay? Because they've given the money, the wealthy people and the economic elites. What was the official wording? Economic elites and organised groups representing business interests. Well, that's an example where they do have a great deal of influence. I've got another example from the United States, and here's an employee of Exxon explaining how Exxon gets politicians in America to table legislation and to make announcements from the floor of the House, whatever that means. I've got it here.
To use the fishing analogy again, just to kind of reel them in, because they're a captive audience. They know they need you and I need them.
Senators pressed to do Exxon's bidding behind closed doors.
You want to be able to go to the chief. Yeah. And so that the chief knows you, that you can go to the chief and say, look, we've got this issue. We need Congressman so-and-so to be able to either introduce this bill. We need him to make a floor statement. We need him to send a letter. Yeah. You name it. We've asked for everything.
So who are the fish?
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this ad because
The biggest catch, according to Mr. Coy, it's the Conservative Democrat Senator Joe Manchin.
Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker.
And the reason Joe Manchin is happy to be so amenable to Exxon isn't because of the money, but because he's also a very wealthy man in his own right, and he founded a coal brokerage business. Madam, what do you think about travelling by Rolls-Royce? They're enormous cars, aren't they?
I've seen such posh car, honestly. I can't imagine the exhaust pipe. It's a nice colour, but I don't recommend it when there are so many other options like public transport. Although public transport does need bettering, there is a much better option than travelling in probably one of the most expensive cars you can see and polluting our air.
Not all the rich are destroying the world on purpose. Some of them are just doing it by accident. The current owners of Farnborough Airport bought it in the autumn of 2019. And if you remember, the big first Extinction Rebellion protest was in April 2019. So it was generally understood that climate change was happening. It was very serious. The owners of the airport didn't seem to realise this at all. Which, if you ask me, buying a private jet airport in the middle of a climate emergency is a bit like buying a house when it's already caught fire. But anyway, the airport owners didn't seem to realise how serious climate change was until Extinction Rebellion started to protest. The first big Extinction Rebellion protest at the airport was in October 2021, and by June 2022 the airport had its net zero plan worked out. Well, now the airport realises how serious climate change is. It's got the word SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, plastered all over its website. But we may know from a previous video, if you've watched that one, that the International Energy Agency has worked out a plan for the big economies of the global north to be carbon neutral by 2050. It involves bioenergy, replacing aviation fuel, which is a fossil fuel, with a bioenergy. You may know from that video now, there's no realistic prospect of having enough raw materials to make the bioenergy. The technology isn't really around yet, and if it did, we'd need so much electricity to power all these processes. In short, it's a video by itself, but it's not really it's not a realistic plan, to say the least. But for the airport, that doesn't matter. They've got a plan. It's the official government policy to increase aviation by 70% by 2050. Just by having that plan, they're able to carry on as they are. Another way the very wealthiest people are destroying the world by accident is, I think, Rupert Murdoch and his business News Corp, or News Corporation. People quite often complain he's a climate change denier and about all the damage his publications do, and you can understand why, because, for example, one of the television stations he owns is Fox News, and that is not well known for its accurate reporting of climate change, to say the least. But an even more damaging television station that News Corp owns is Sky News Australia, and according to people who've looked into this, a large proportion of all the climate denial stories that go around the world, a lot of them on social media, all start off on Sky News Australia. But News Corp accepts climate change is happening, and it takes it very seriously. News Corp has meticulously documented its own carbon footprint since 2006 and sought to take a leadership role on the issue of climate change by reducing it. News Corporation actually thought carbon pricing was a good idea. News Corp also modelled the potential financial damage it faced due to extreme weather, wildfires and other physical dangers intensified by climate change. The company believes it is in a better position than others to mitigate those risks. It knows climate change is happening, but it doesn't seem to feel any moral need to tell the people its number one concern is making money. If Fox News, if Sky News Australia are successful, that's all it's concerned about. So I think that's another example of the very wealthiest people losing their moral compass and not feeling a need to act in a positive moral way. In some ways, with people buying private jet airports in the middle of a climate emergency and then developing it, so they're building a new hangar, they've opened as Gulfstream have a maintenance department there. So while everyone's trying to reduce their carbon emissions, people are opening new business jet airports, making things worse. I sometimes feel that getting people to tackle climate change is like bailing out a sinking boat while other people are making new holes to let more water in. And the problem is, the longer the airport is there, the longer it's open for, the more the local community comes to rely on it. And whereas if they hadn't have opened an airport in the first place, if they'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars investing in other things, then we would never have been in this situation. They could have made their money in other areas. So really, in this case, I think they're destroying the world by accident.
Private jets! Ban 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 private jets!
The fourth way I think the wealthy are destroying the world is by they're bending the rules, and being wealthy, they're allowed to get away with it. So for example, so far, I've been calling Farnborough Airport a private jet airport, but officially it's a business jet airport. And that's because when planning permission was granted for it to, well, there's been an airfield here for over 100 years. It's the first place in Britain where a heavier than air machine flew, piloted by Samuel Cody, an American. So there's been an airfield here 100 years. The airport's quite a new addition, and it was only granted planning permission if the flights were just for business jets, because it was realised the noise and pollution would have a detrimental effect on people living around the airport, but it was thought it was okay to justify that if it was only for business needs and not for going on holiday. Here is something from a local campaign group which is called the Farnborough Noise Campaign Group. It's on Facebook, you can look it up. The airport has a permit to operate business flights only and not holiday flights. This is because the business case justification for noise disruption to the public was offset by inward investment from business flights. Clearly, the many flights to Ibiza, Nice, Palma, Bodrum and other places are not business flights and should not be allowed. And here's a website that's advertising flights it provides from Farnborough Airport, Geneva, Nice, Palma, somewhere in the Alps, Malaga, and you can track where the aircraft are going here, even with just an app on your phone. So you can see in the summer that a lot of them seem to be going to the Mediterranean, and in the winter a lot of them seem to be going to the Alps for the skiing. And to be fair to the airport, they say we don't ask people the reason for their flight, and I'm guessing even if they did, it's far from clear that the wealthy people would tell them the truth. Remember, they're more likely to cheat when playing games. They've lost their moral compass. They probably think it's outrageous tyranny, somebody's checking up on what they're doing. Now in Britain, if you build a house without planning permission, the council will make you tear it down. If you have a business airport and you're running it to provide holiday flights, nobody seems to mind. And in fact, at the Farnborough Air Show, the world famous Farnborough Air Show every 2 years, they entertained local councillors, local politicians, and they had a nice meal and a drink, and they all posted on Facebook what a lovely time they had, and they were very impressed with SAF, and they wanted to have more flights because it's good for business. Which should be no surprise, because economic elites and organised groups representing business interests have substantial impacts on US government policy, and I expect the policy of most governments. And all the time, some people would say, the Farnborough Noise Group would say, they're acting illegally. People can see where the flights are going. Nobody seems to mind, because as we saw before, wealthy people think they can get away with anything, and with good reason. But it doesn't come down to that. Another reason why people might not tell the truth about the purpose of their flight was because I think the tax liability is much higher if we're using a private jet for pleasure rather than just for business. And many of those aircraft there, it's quite possible many of the aircraft at Farnborough Airport are registered to overseas tax havens. There's all sorts of benefits. For example, if you were to buy a bicycle in Britain, the sales tax is 20%. It's called VAT. You have to pay 20% VAT. Lewis Hamilton, who has a private jet, had his private jet flown to the Isle of Man. He stayed there a couple of hours. They got a full refund for their VAT. And you might think, well, this is outrageous. How are the rich allowed to go around doing this? Having offshore tax havens and all this sort of thing. Well, it's well known. Wealthy people like them because it saves them tax. Remember, wealthy people are more likely to lie on their tax returns than ordinary people. And the British government has no idea of how much tax it's losing. One clue as to the cause of all this is Rishi Sunak, one of the richest prime ministers Britain's ever had. He's had in the past offshore funds in tax havens, so he's benefited from himself. And I'm guessing the donors, who that lady was referring to earlier on, donors of the Conservative Party, have money invested in tax havens as well. And you can save quite a lot of money by a tax haven. For example, if you own a business, and it's quite possible if you're rich enough to run a private jet, you've got a business, so you've worked hard all your life, well done, and provided useful goods and services to society. You have a business, instead of taking the profits out and paying income tax on them, you can register your company in an overseas tax haven, in a shell company, and then you take the money out of your business to the shell company in the tax haven and use it to buy your private jet, which is now owned by the shell company. Maybe it also buys your private yacht, buys your houses. So none of the money's been taxed yet because it's just all within the shell company. And then you can use your private jet pretending it's for business, but you could be using it for pleasure. And if you don't want to pay inheritance tax, you just make your children directors of the shell company. Job done. When you die, they just carry on running the business, living in the houses, flying in the private jets. This is well known. Who's going to do anything about it when the wealthy donors are donating to one of the major political parties in Britain? And I guess that's true in other countries as well. And now, the fifth way that the wealthy people are destroying the world. So far, we've been holding other people's faults in front of our eyes, but keeping our own faults behind our backs. The wealthiest 10% of people in the world are responsible for half of all the CO2 that humans are causing to be emitted, whereas the poorest half of all the people in the world are only responsible for 10% of carbon emissions. And I think to be in the world's top 10%, you need to have an income of £33,000 or above, and to be in the top 1%, you need an income of around about £95,000 a year. So I'm guessing a lot of people, possibly most people in Britain, would be in that wealthy 10%. And just like those the wealthy people we've been criticising, who like to carry on living their high carbon lifestyles and think it outrageous tyranny if anyone suggests they ought to reduce it or reduce their water usage and things like that. Most people in Britain, and I'm guessing it's true for me in some respects, we carry on living our lives knowing full well the damage we're doing, and it's the damage we're doing to the poor people in the global south. At the moment it's COP27 in Egypt. The world's governments are discussing whether or not the wealthy countries in the world should pay loss and damage money to the poor countries in the global south. Carbon footprints and the lifestyles that we all have living in the global north, we have such high carbon footprints. The technology, as we saw in a previous video, carbon capture and storage and bioenergy, has no realistic prospect of being useful in time to save the world. So the United Nations in the last couple of years has started to ask people to change their lifestyle. Now this is a really radical step, because until now even groups like Extinction Rebellion would never dream of telling people how to live their lives. XR is all about system change, not climate change. You know, if you switch on a light switch, you're causing natural gas or coal to be burnt to generate electricity. So we're all sort of stuck in this system that's very polluting, and the only way to tackle it really on a global scale is to transition to a zero carbon economy. To do that you need the governments and the big corporations to do that. But the United Nations realises it's not working, and therefore it started to ask people to change their lifestyles in the last couple of years. And it thinks if we were to drive less, eat less meat, and do all those sorts of things, we could reduce the world's carbon emissions by between 40% and 70% by 2050. And you could easily do it. For example, it's thought that about 1/3 of all the food is wasted. In the UK, nearly 60% of all trips less than 5 miles are by car, even though you could easily do it on a bicycle or by public transport. The housing in Britain has very poor insulation, and not only do we continue to fly, but the number of flights in the world are going up. The General Secretary of the United Nations has recently said, if the rich countries don't start paying compensation to the poor countries and giving them money so they can transition, and including possibly writing off debts, because if you're a country in the global south with big debts, it's very difficult to justify spending money on other things until you've paid your debts off. So letting the poor countries off debts, unless we sort all these things out, we are doomed. So I'm hoping the idea of being doomed might persuade the rich who are in positions of power and influence on the world's governments. Maybe they will start to act. It's unlikely, but you have to be positive about these things, don't you? So that's the end of the video. I think I've proved conclusively that it's the rich, not only do they cause the most pollution, but by their influence and their habits of bending the rules are stopping us tackling climate change. The one thing I've learned from this video is I've noticed some of the characteristics the rich have. You tend to pick up as you get older. You know, you've earned your money, you're less reliant on other people. So I've been trying very hard to be nice to people recently. This video to me has been like the ghost of Christmas future visiting Ebenezer Scrooge. So every day's a school date. So thank you for watching. Feel free to share the video and all that sort of stuff. Leave a comment if you want to. But thank you for listening. I haven't decided what the next video will be yet. So hopefully though, in another month's time I shall make another video. So thank you for watching and goodbye.